What is the best way to engage all your stakeholders in culture?
This podcast is brought to you by Arcamed, fast and focused design and manufacturing.
I'm Greg Maurer, founder and owner of Arcamed.
And I'm Caroline Squatrigo, talent engagement specialist. We are on a journey to grow, learn, and gain expertise in small to mid-size company culture. Join us.
Okay, Caroline, what's the question of the day?
So today we're going to be talking about how to engage all stakeholders in company culture. So first, we have the pleasure to be joined with our own Jason Sizen. Jason is a manufacturing engineer here, and he is also the Wellness Committee Chair on Arcamed's Culture Committee. So definitely an engaged employee, and we're excited to hear from him. And after that, we're going to speak with another Jason Cochran, and he is a psychologist and also the co-founder of iAspire.
So, Jason, thanks for joining us today. And you're, as I said, you're clearly an engaged employee, and I'm so appreciative and thankful that you want to contribute to company culture. And I'd love to get your take on how we're doing. We have this culture committee structure.
Okay, so I feel as though a company culture with zero oversight is 100% determined by the people that you hire. So the culture committee acts as a way to bring that percentage closer to 50%, in my opinion. Everyone in the organization should be a stakeholder in the culture. However, there are obviously those who have more extroverted opinions than others. Usually the loudest voices tend to be the ones that are heard. But the question is, how do you engage those loudest voices if they don't necessarily want to be engaging in the company culture? I think the culture committee is an ideal place that allows these individuals to inject their positive ideology into our culture.
So does it ever feel like a burden? You're a busy guy. You got a lot on your plate. We're asking a lot of everybody, and does everyone, as much as you love the company culture, which is great, do you ever say, oh man, 11 a.m. culture committee meeting, I got so much to do, I don't want to go?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think because we're in a manufacturing environment, everybody is focused on the deadline. So whenever these things come up, you're always trying to balance, this project needs to get out or this needs to ship today. How can you justify taking an hour to do a culture committee meeting? I definitely feel those concerns, and I definitely feel it, whenever a culture committee meeting comes up. But I think it's super important to have that proper balance because you're really only talking about an hour out of the month. So as long as we're still achieving the deadlines that we have and we're at 98% on-time delivery, I think, people need to understand that that is the kind of balance that we need in order to keep the culture the same as we grow.
So is there anything that leadership can do to foster an environment at the culture committee where people are more excited to attend? And I mean, does everyone feel like they're having a positive impact and that what they're doing is important? Because that's key for us.
I think the trick there is engagement versus continuous improvement on the engagement. So we can ask for as much engagement as possible. Everybody could engage in this culture committee. However, if we're not making the proper actions on top of that engagement, that's where people start to feel, hey, is this really working? My ideas aren't being heard. That might be the sentiment that gets brought up. From a managing standpoint, I think it's important for us to show people why it's so important. So maybe take examples of things that people bring up and show how we're trying to improve that culture through the committee. That might be a good way. Maybe sending out summaries could be a good way for us to start showing, the changes that we're making, because we can ask for as much engagement as we want, but it's really important to be acting on that engagement.
Yeah, so I'm glad we're talking about time here. And, Greg mentioned you were busy. And I think if you're employed here, like you're busy. That's just how we are. We have these people with a lot of responsibilities, and that's part of our culture. Um, Part of our culture is moving quickly. And like you said, we have great on time delivery, we have great lead times, and that's because we all work really hard. So, how do you think culture should be prioritized? Because on the one hand, our culture is kind of, I think, what drives us to that success of that, fast focus mentality. But then again, we're asking people to step away from their jobs and go into this meeting or engage with the culture committee. And it almost feels like a catch-22 to me, because it's like you need to focus on the culture, but then, the culture is being really good and fast and focused at your job. So, I mean, how do you think culture should be prioritized in relation to all of that?
So yeah, I think that's a really important question. Essentially, I think the fact that everybody is so focused on the deadline and understands the importance of those deadlines is a reflection of our culture. Now, whether or not that's what we bring up in every culture committee, I don't think that's necessarily what I'm saying, but I think that the fact that everybody is so focused on these deadlines means that we're doing something right, because there are a lot of places that don't have that level of on-time delivery, that don't have that level of commitment to the jobs that we have. I think the fact that we have a group of people that is so committed to those deadlines, I think it really just kind of shows a reflection of our culture. Now, I think it's important to define what that culture is, because like I was saying earlier, if you have no oversight of what our goals are, what our culture should be, then it's 100% determined by the people that you hire. But if you start to inject these ideas of continuous improvement and our values, that starts to define for people, this is what working at Arcamed is about. So I think the balance is just understanding that the fact that we have this motivated group of people is in part due to the fact that we have such a strong culture.
Yeah, I like that analogy about the 100% to 50%. So, culture is a lot about who you hire and also who you fire, and company culture has to be sort of organic as it develops, but you can manage it, right? So that's how, if we start to manage it, that's how we get to a 50%. So 50% of our culture is about who we hire and fire, and 50% is about how we manage it as we grow. So I think that's key. I guess the question is a culture committee the right tool? And I guess for me, that's an open question still.
I completely agree that it's an open question. It's tough because, like I was saying, I mean, we already have these people that are motivated to hitting these deadlines. So is the culture committee really impacting that? I would say probably not. But what I will say is that giving people the opportunity to engage in the way that our company's culture moves forward and grows is extremely important. And I think that's really the whole goal of the culture committee. Now, whether or not it directly impacts culture on a day-to-day, or if it's more about what we do in the future, I think that's kind of the difference. I think it more or less has to do with how things progress and how we keep the same culture going forward as we grow.
Well, Jason, I appreciate your perspective and your commitment to our company culture, and it's so wonderful to see how much you care about company culture and about your fellow employees and about the business and about your job, and it's just great that we're on a team together. So thanks for the time. And so now, I guess now we'll shift to talk to Jason Cochran and see what we can learn. He's an expert on engagement with company culture. So let's talk to Jason.
Well, hello. We are here with Jason Cochran. He is a psychologist and the co-founder of iAspire. iAspire is an intelligent culture assistant that automatically attracts, develops, and retains your talent to become a destination employer. Jason, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me. Excited to be on with you and your listeners today.
Yeah, we're very happy to have you. I think you're going to be able to help us out with our topic of the day. And I want to start out with kind of a big question, but we've been talking a lot about engagement and how to develop that with employees. Do you think it's a foregone conclusion that employees want to have a role in the develop and maintenance of a company culture?
Well, that's a great question, especially to lead with. I'll put it this way, it better be. And by that, I mean, if you are hiring people who are not interested in the culture or having a role in helping lead the culture or contribute to it in some meaningful way, then they're already disengaged before you even hired them. So for me, if you're going to look at hiring someone, you're bringing them on your team, then absolutely they should be engaged in understanding your culture, understanding your values, but also saying, here's how I can add some additional flavor to your culture. Here's the things that I bring to the table. So for me, it would be a foregone conclusion that if I'm going to have someone on my team, then I want them invested in and very interested in contributing to our culture.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. I know we often hire for people who, what as we say it, would enjoy our culture. Because we certainly don't want anyone to come in and feel like they're excluded. We want them to come in and feel like they're a part of it. But what about people who they feel like the culture is a good fit for them, but they just want to concentrate on their job and their fellow employees, and they feel like that's enough engagement?
Yeah, for them, those are key parts of the culture, right? The way that you engage with your teammates, with your leaders, with customers, those are all very important aspects of culture. And so, if, for lack of a better term, if they want to stay in their lane and they say, you know what, I don't need to be on the strategic side of things, I really just want to focus on my fellow employees or customers and helping them have a good experience, that's awesome because that's a key part of having a healthy culture and healthy employee experiences and customer experiences. So if that's the lane where they see where they can make their best contributions, then absolutely, then that's where I would encourage them to focus most of their efforts.
So, Jason, it sounds like some employees may just want to live the culture, and that is engagement, and that is caring about the company culture. Uh, so, is there other ways to engage employees to have an impact on culture beyond just living it, enjoying it, and contributing to it by interacting with their employees in a positive way? Is there a way to engage that doesn't really feel forced? That doesn't feel like, gosh, I don't want to show up to this 11 o'clock culture committee meeting. I have other things to do. I don't want it to feel like a burden.
Absolutely. That's a great question, Greg. And you bring up, an important talking point there regarding meetings. I mean, all of us raise our hand if we felt like we've been in meetings before where it's like, okay, what's the purpose of this meeting? Is it really leading anywhere? Is it contributing and making any value adds in some way? And certainly that's where I've seen for some companies when they approach the idea of doing a culture committee, where it can fall flat on its face. If it just turns into another meeting to have a meeting and just have some talking points about your culture, it's probably not going to lead anywhere. And it certainly isn't going to get people animated or excited. And so where I've really seen companies have a lot more success is when they take things that are typically called like culture committees and really transform those into more human-centered design employee experience groups. And that's where you start applying like design thinking principles to thinking about what kind of experiences do we want to have for our people from the moment they onboard to the moment that they offboard and every point in between in that life cycle. What are the experiences that are going to help them feel connected better with themselves, feel connected better with their teammates, connected with their role, and connected with the organization at a high level? And so we've found typically when we engage in that kind of way, as opposed to having a culture committee, but having a very clear focus and saying we are going to use design principles to actually design the type of experiences that are going to get the best from our people, that tends to be more engaging for people because number one, there's a clear structure to it. and there's background on the effectiveness of human-centered design approaches. Josh Bersin is a wonderful expert in that area. So I encourage any listeners today, if you want to know more about human-centered design when it comes to employee experience and how that makes a healthy culture, look up Josh Bersin. He's got some incredible stuff. But the other thing that it does is upfront, it's going to let your people know on that team that we're not just going to waste time. So we're not just going to have a meeting so that we feel good that we're talking about culture. We actually are going to be taking some evidence-based steps to actually shape and do the strategies of what is going to get the job done for us in terms of the kind of experiences that our people want to have here in the workplace. And so just really quickly, like what are, some of those key steps when it comes to trying to come up with, a process that's human-centered design. Like it's all about getting those ideas out on the table and then coming up with like the type of problems that you're trying to solve, brainstorm the ideas and the solutions, and then you're going to go into prototype mode. So start actually testing and developing those strategies, get them out to your people, and then start collecting feedback on whether or not that's starting to move the needle for you in regard to your culture.
I like that idea you bring up, and I'm a member of our culture committee, so I'm guilty on that front, but I'll bring that up at our next meeting. How can we think about things more in a people-focused design aspect? And we'll have to do some research on that. One thing we have experienced is just people being burnt out. Our committee it's voluntary. You can kind of join as you want, and you're certainly not bound to it for an indefinite period of time. But we find that, a lot of times the same employees are interested, and as they burn out, they rotate off, and we don't always have another group to come in. Do you think that there is a certain size company? We're at about 80 employees, so we're not very big. Is there a certain critical mass or size of a company where you get enough people to be engaged, a big enough percentage of people to be engaged in something like that, where you don't have as much burnout, or at least you have people to kind of step in and take over the gauntlet, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure that there's a magical number. My guess would be that what typically comes out of the meetings is what is going to either energize people or make them feel like, okay, this is just another thing on my to-do list that I need to check off. And that's where a lot of those human-centered design principles and thinking through the employee experience lens can really help, because that model really is the evolution of engagement, where engagement was, okay, we're going to survey our people and we're going to try to figure out what their sentiments or opinions are about our culture, about the work that we do. But employee experience takes it to the next level, which is it's not just enough to measure. You've got to quickly and efficiently respond. So funny story, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate. I have a bad habit sometimes of asking my wife a question at home or asking for advice, and then I'll do like the opposite, or I won't actually take the advice. And a lot of times that happens in organizations too with the engagement surveys. They've kind of become almost like annual reviews. The surveys go out, you ask for opinion from people on things, but then if there's not follow through on it, if there's not actual action that they see that's driving results, then people can tend to become reactive to that and think, well, why are we even going through the motions here if it's not actually delivering results for us? And it just looks like it to do. So one of the ways I often recommend to combat that is get practical before you get surgical. And here's what I mean by that. For a lot of organizations, before you start getting into the nitty gritty of doing what I would call tier 2 level experiences, focus on your tier 1. That's your core. There should be a core rhythm of employee experiences that are going on in an organization. That's just part of the ingredients of having a healthy culture. And so I'll give you 5 really quickly that the research has told us are key ingredients to having a healthy culture, regardless of the size of your company or what industry you're in. Those five are frequent, meaningful recognition, frequent feedback loops, autonomy, opportunities to develop and grow, and a bigger sense of purpose. And so typically, if you can get practical, and if of those five things, if there are certain experiences in the employee life cycle where you don't have things designed around those, that's where I would start is make sure that you've got your core rhythm first. Think of it like a well-balanced diet from the food pyramid. Do those things first before you start thinking, okay, we actually have some problems or challenges here. And you start getting more surgical in terms of doing surveys or implementing, committees to dig in on looking at some data and coming up with some tier 2 level experiences. So those are some of the things I'd recommend to help reduce some of the burnout. Is number one, make sure those committees or meetings, whatever you want to call them, have that very clearly defined purpose and outcomes for what's expected for success that's going to engage people. And then number two, maybe even before you get to that point, are you doing the things first that are very practical in nature, those core rhythms, before you start delegating resources and people's time to dig in and get more surgical with what you're offering?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Uh, Fascinating way of thinking about it. And I think oftentimes we get really excited about what we want to do with our company culture, and we sort of jump to those tier 2 employee experiences. I wanted to go back to the idea of replacing a culture committee with an employee experience, I guess, task force. Is that still something that gets staffed by employees?
Yeah, absolutely, Greg. Yeah, that's the key. So you want to think about, okay, who's the person that's sitting in the center of the human-centered design? Who are the experiences for? And it's for your employees. And so depending on the makeup of your organization, you want to make sure that when you have that task force, I like that word that you used, that you have a really well-balanced representation of your employees that are on that task force. Because if you don't, there are going to be certain aspects of your organization where you're not getting the right input or signals in terms of what the real experience is like for the employee. And so making sure you've got a diverse group, that's on that task force, I think is very imperative to get as close of approximation as you can to what the real picture is of what it looks like to work for that organization. And at the end of the day, I mean, all of us, whenever we're trying to get a strategy or initiative going with folks, top down approaches, yes, leadership has to lead, but whenever you get buy in from people is when they feel like they're involved, where they have a voice that's helping to shape things and it's collaborative in nature. And so I've often seen for organizations where it's something where they'll only have managers or leaders sit on those. And then it's almost like, okay, from on top of the mountain, now we're going to disseminate and say, here's the plan we came up with. Those strategies will burn people out really quickly because they don't feel like they were involved. And they may actually miss the mark, to be honest, because if you want to hit the mark, you've got to make sure the person in the center of that design process is who it's intended for. So absolutely making sure that it's something that is employee led and that they're the ones that are driving it is important, not only for their engagement and involvement, but also to make sure that the results and the things that you're going to do tactically are the things that your people are saying what need to be worked on, so that you're focusing your efforts in the right place.
Okay, so would you suggest that a C-level or ownership representative attend and be on this task force, which would show the support it has from the top? Or should that person not be on the task force, which shows that these other employees are empowered to drive this kind of effort?
It depends. And I know that sounds like I'm kind of, talking on either side. And here's why it depends. If there's already been clear, explicit communication from leadership about the purpose of the team and that there will not be any kind of retribution for people being 100% open and honest about what it's like to work in the organization, then absolutely you could have someone from the leadership team there, as long as that communication has been there and that the people on the team are saying, yes, it's okay to be there. The last thing that you would want is for an executive to be there and for them to influence the discussion in a way that brings up false positives, where people are saying things, but it's not really the reality of what they're experiencing. And so it can go either way, but I would want to make sure first that the people on the team are okay with it. And then also that there's already that level of trust that's been built. And that comes from the leader communicating to the task force and saying, I am just going to be a spectator to listen. This in no way, shape, or form is going to affect your employment, promotions. There's not going to be any retribution. The purpose of this task force really is for us to get this right for you. And so I'm just there to be a listening ear, but that you want people to feel very comfortable and create an atmosphere of psychological safety where people feel like they can be their authentic selves, give real answers without retribution of some kind from the organization.
Yeah, that's certainly what we would intend to do. Always difficult as a leader to know whether that has actually been internalized by the folks being led. I want to go back to this really neat sentence you said about getting practical before you get surgical, and you listed these five employee experience opportunities that are in the practical bucket. And I wanted to share our view on that, or at least my view, that those things are led by leadership. And so frequent recognition is something that the leaders do. We've created feedback loop. We have a culture of autonomy. There's really not a lot of micromanaging, and people are empowered to make a difference in their areas. Lots of growth opportunities, and we certainly hope there's a sense of purpose. And so, would you say that the employee experience task force, that's the surgical arm, if leadership is the practical arm?
Absolutely. That's a great way of putting it, Greg. I think that's a perfect visualization. Yeah, those things you talked about, those core rhythms, those are just things that need to be in place, and that can be led by leadership because it's just part of your core offering to people in the marketplace to say, here's why you should work here. Here's why our culture is amazing. We already have a well balanced core of things that are necessary for you to have amazing experiences here and contribute to something bigger than yourself. And so then that surgical arm would be your task force then that says, okay, we've got a healthy core that's getting us to a certain level of engagement or certain human capital metrics. But to take things to the next level, let's get more surgical and figure out where are some of those gaps that we still have, even after having our well balanced diet. And then let's get in there and really formulate a plan and a strategy around those things that are going to take things to the next level. So I think that's a great way of looking at it.
So, what about other stakeholders? So we have a lot of concentration on our employees, which I think is appropriate. But we also have vendors that are part of our experience and part of who we are as a company. Obviously, we have customers. We have a board of directors. Should we be thinking more, I guess, globally about engaging these other stakeholders in our company culture?
I think so. I think so. And what helps me many times when I think in terms of culture, brand engagement, things of that nature is, culture is really an internal thing. Culture is what your internal stakeholders think of the organization as a whole. Brand is what those external stakeholders think of when they hear your company's name or see your company's logo. And so, there's an important distinction there. But I come back to something that I heard a long time ago, and that is it's hard to read the label from inside the jar. And by that I mean whenever a person is trying to grow, an organization is trying to grow, if you're only getting feedback from a certain segment, then you can become perceptually blind to some blind spots that might be there. And that's why it's so critically important that you are getting input from other vendors, from customers, so that you can make sure that you're getting as clear of a picture as possible of what your culture, or in this case, with the external, your brand actually is. How is it perceived out in the market? And so I absolutely think that's quintessential when you're looking at your strategy, is to not just keep it something internal, where you're talking about your internal culture, but culture should be linked to brand. And there should be some mechanisms for getting that input in an efficient way with your external stakeholders. And one other point on that, don't just ask your customers who love you and you know that you're going to get really good feedback. Find the ones, like talk with some of your account executives and say, hey, or your customer, success folks, and say, um, who are some of our customers that have just put us through the ringer and that we hear from all the time? You want to make sure that you're getting a well-rounded view of what your brand is, out in the market and how it's perceived. So I agree with you wholeheartedly that part of a core strategy for organizations should be, to get those external inputs as well, regarding the culture and brand.
Thank you. I think that'll help us a lot in making sure we're hitting the right marks and talking to the right people. Um, so before I moved into more of an HR role, I was responsible for the marketing at Arcamed, and I learned that someone told me once, you want to make sure that what you're projecting or what your brand is also matches up with what's really happening. In other words, we certainly don't want to be lying, and we don't want to be misleading people, and we want to be honest about who we are and how we go about serving our customer and serving our employees. One thing that was always a struggle, though, was getting employees engaged in that external brand, and getting them involved in, showing people who we are. We love to internally engage, but sometimes people don't always want to be the one on, whether it's like social media or an ad or whatever it is. And it's kind of seen as outside of their job because they're not in marketing. How do you recommend we engage people in that external brand and getting them to really show people who they are, given that they're the people actually working on our products?
Yeah, we need some brand ambassadors.
Yes.
There you go. Greg just answered it. Absolutely. I love that idea. But I love that you bring up the whole marketing aspect there, Caroline, because that's essentially what we're doing, right? This whole movement of EX, which is employee experience, kind of came out of CX, which is customer experience. And we've spent, as organizations and businesses over the last 10 years, so much data and research has come out in understanding the buyer's journey and really mapping that out and understanding along that journey, there's certain kinds of experiences or content that's going to be helpful for people along the way to help them solve their problems or help them make progress. And we're now seeing a lot of those core principles be applied internally in terms of how we think about the employee journey and what it's like to work for a company. And so many times I've also heard from organizations that it is helpful to definitely have someone from the marketing team, if they're not leading it, to be one of the participants in the task force, because they definitely bring some perspective from the design thinking perspective of really being able to put that employee through that simulation, just like they often do with the buyer, the prospect, or the customer, and how to nurture those relationships. So I definitely think that brand ambassador idea, along with having some marketing principles, is something that could really help with getting some of those external inputs inside the organization.
Well, Jason, I really enjoyed this discussion. I know Caroline did as well. We've been struggling with the idea of a culture committee, and whether that's really the structure that should continue to serve us in this aspect. And I loved hearing about that employee experience task force kind of concept. We'll get a link to Josh Bersin and put that in our comments so that other folks can check him out too. And then also appreciate that you gave us sort of a global look at engaging other stakeholders. So this was really wonderful. We appreciate your time and your help, and we learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners did as well. Is there anything you want our listeners to know about iAspire?
I'm sure. Yeah, we are a technology company here in Indianapolis. We started working with schools to help schools have healthy climates and cultures. And a lot of the work we did, businesses started saying we need to do the same thing in business. We're doing engagement surveys, but we're still not moving the needle with our people. And that's where we stepped in and said it's all about employee experience. That's where the research is pointing toward. And so for us, it's all about delivering those experiences. That's what our software platform does, and then measuring them. So you, as an owner or as a leadership team, have peace of mind knowing that the experiences are being delivered in the way that they're intended to be delivered. There's reminders, and then it's being measured along the way too to make sure that we're delivering a return on investment. So it's certainly one of those things where employee experience, you can do it without technology, but my goodness, it really is a challenge to keep up with, especially when you're dealing with X, Y, and Z in your day to day. That oftentimes it's helpful to have, a software solution that can become your assistant and take care of driving that strategy for you.
Well, thanks for all you do for the businesses that care about their company culture, because it has such a wonderful impact on the employees and their families, and it's really a web. And so we appreciate all that you do. And thanks for coming on today.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me, and have a wonderful day.
So Jason's got a super cool approach of focusing on the employee experience, and it was fun to learn about. So Greg, I'm going to ask you today, what did we learn?
Well, Caroline, I think we learned a lot. This question was on our minds because we have a culture committee, and we weren't quite sure whether that was working well or whether that was the best practice or some old archaic thing that just stuck around because it was how we always did things. So first thing I learned is you don't need to serve on a committee to engage in the culture. And not everybody enjoys committee work, but you can still engage into the company culture by walking the walk and by exhibiting those behaviors. So that's one thing I learned. And as you said at the top, I really like Jason's approach, his employee experience task force approach versus a culture committee approach.
Yeah, I mean, his advice on using human-centered design approaches intrigued me. I've never heard it put that way before, but after talking through it with him, it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I want to learn more about this. I scheduled a meeting with him because I'm so curious about it. So I think he has a kind of a new take on it that I feel like could be very productive.
I'm thrilled that you are connecting with Jason because I want to learn more about this too. I can't wait to hear back after your meeting what you learned and how we might incorporate some of that into how Arcamed does things. Jason's advice on including leadership was also interesting. Leadership can be included on a task force, in Jason's estimation, only if there's an unmistakable feeling of safety to share and speak freely, which is what Mark Howell told us back on episode 7. That safe space and that feeling of being able to share. But how does the leader figure that out? I like to think that I bring a safe space for everybody, but is that really the case? I don't know. It's touchy. I think probably a leader should remain engaged, but not necessarily be in full attendance at all these different task force meetings.
Yeah, I think it's hard. As much as I know all of our leaders here want to have that, safe space mentality around them. I mean, just by nature of being a leader, I think, it gets in your head. I've had meetings with people that I have great relationships with, and all of a sudden I'm hit with anxiety, even though there's no reason to be anxious. I think it just happens naturally. But finding that balance so that, the committee or task force or whatever culture initiative you have has the support of the leader, the resources that they need, without feeling like they're being controlled or pushed in one direction based on, that leader's agenda.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Jason had these tiers he talked about of engagements, and tier 1 really spoke to me because it's up to the leaders to make sure tier 1's a success. And he mentioned frequent recognition as a component, feedback loops, some aspect of autonomy, a effort to develop people and to give everybody a sense of purpose. So that's really, as leaders, I feel like that's our task. These are things that we need to do for our people to engage them in company culture. I think it's a great place to start.
Yeah, I mean, this is cultural strategy when you get down to it, and this is what we're looking for. So I'm grateful that we had the opportunity to talk to him about this.
And then when you learn more about these employee engagement task forces and how we might structure them well, I think that would be tier 2, the employee task forces. And that gets a little bit more, I think he referenced, it gets a little more surgical. So there's a process of coming up with ideas, getting feedback, prototyping. I don't think we're ready for that yet, but I'm hopeful that after we learn a little bit more about Jason's approach that we will be.
Yeah, I mean, I still think it's going to be a challenge to get everyone involved in the ideation process, because it is work and it can be tedious, but I guess that's our task as leaders, is to find the way to empower people to want to be part of that process. So I think we have a lot to think about. We've learned a lot today.
Yeah, lots to think about.
On our next episode, we will discuss the interaction between community values and company values.